Okay, so just so you know what my friend was looking for in a PC, he wanted something that's more productivity based. So he doesn't plan on doing much, if any, gaming with this PC. Certain components that we want to go with, we can save some money and still have a decent level of performance. All right, so let's go through it. All right, so for the CPU, I picked the 7900X, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, the 7950X, although it performs better, the price to performance between that one and the 7900X, the price doesn't really justify that performance versus the 7900X. Still a good CPU, don't get me wrong, but the 7900X was more cost effective and performs almost as good. Those of you that are wondering why I didn't go with the 9900X, similar reason. You get maybe somewhere between a 3 to 6% uplift on the 9900X versus the 7900X. And so the price to performance just made more sense to go with the 7900X. And if he decides to upgrade sometime in the future, then we could take a look at the 9950X or even the 9950X3D when that rolls out, depending on the price points and the performance boosts that we can see for it from a productivity standpoint. All right, so 7900X. For the CPU cooler, we're going to go with Thermalright's Peerless Assassin 120 SE, and mostly because it's just from a cost effectiveness standpoint and from a cooling standpoint, it's really tough to beat the Peerless Assassin when it comes to air cooler, and especially from a cost standpoint. You know, if you try to match up the same price points, then kind of tough to beat. This one's kind of a goat. So for storage, we want a decent amount of storage because obviously with productivity work, the file sizes can get on the larger side. And so we want to make sure that the storage that he has is going to be satisfactory to him for quite a while. And so we went with a 4 terabyte Crucial T705. And this one has a 14 gigabyte read speed and like I want to say 13.5 gigabyte write speed. For the RAM, we're going to go with the Corsair Vengeance 6000 megahertz CL30. We're going to go with the 6000 megahertz instead of something like a 6400 or a 7200. Not because those aren't good sticks, but from a stability standpoint, right now, as things sit, the 6000 to 6400 megahertz is probably the best way to go for UDIMs. And so I think 6000 megahertz is going to be more than enough, especially with the cast latency of 30. And we're going to go with 64 gigabytes instead of 32. 32 would have been great if he was doing primarily gaming, but a lot of productivity work can sometimes require a decent amount of RAM. And so 64 gigs of 6000 megahertz should be more than ample for the things that he's going to do. All right, for the power supply, we're going to use the MSI Mag A850GL, which is PCIe 5.0 ready, or 5.1 ready at this point. I'm a big fan of the MSI power supplies, especially when it comes to the 12 volt high power cable, because it's got that yellow connector to it where you can tell if you're fully seated or not. And so that's one of my favorite things. Plus, it's a pretty good product, and from a cost standpoint versus what they offer, it's a pretty good deal. So and 850 watts is going to be more than ample for the build we're doing today. For the motherboard, another MSI product, so the Mag X870 Tomahawk. And I've used this board before. Really liked what this board had to offer, especially from like an I/O standpoint, but as well, the GPU doesn't share lanes. The top PCIe slot does not share lanes, and so that's always nice to have, where you don't have to worry about it. And from a cost standpoint, it's a pretty good price. MSI actually is usually pretty competitive on their motherboard prices versus what they offer. For the GPU, yet another MSI one, we're going to go with the 4070 Super, which is actually one of my favorite RTX GPUs at this point. From a cost to performance standpoint, it stands out to me, especially if you're doing gaming. Now, although he's not going to be doing much, if any, gaming with this PC, if he chose to do gaming, this will hold up nice. But at the same time, he does need something that's strong enough to handle productivity work in case he wanted to allocate some of the GPU power to exporting files or doing video editing of any kind, things like that. And so the 4070 Super should be more than ample for him, and he should be really happy with it. Plus, it keeps the cost a little bit down, because at this point, at the time we bought the components, the 4070 Super was still selling at its historical price, whereas anything above that, starting with the 4070 Ti and up, they were starting to deplete inventory in the market, and so the prices were slowly going up, and it just didn't make sense to get other cards that you're actually paying more for than you should. And for the case, we're going to go with the King 95 Pro Black version, and it's a good looking case, and he wanted something that was going to do decent on thermals, so that case comes with an optional mesh front instead of the curved glass, so he has that opportunity for increased airflow. It performs pretty decently on thermals, whether you have the glass panel on or the mesh panel. It comes with 6 ARGB fans, and from an aesthetic standpoint, it's a good looking case, and he wanted something that's going to look nice as well. So yeah, I think that's going to be a pretty good case, and I'm a little excited about that one because I haven't built in that case yet, and so it should be fun to try it out and see what it's like to build in it. So let's get started. All right, had a bit of a scare when I tried to start this PC up, but I resolved it, and I'll talk about it on the back end. Right now, let's just turn this on and see what we get. And there we are. So average 65 FPS, just native 1440p. So let's try it at 1080p. It's a good looking PC, huh? I'm pretty happy with this build. There were some frustrations that I ran into with some of it. Let's start with the Crucial T705 SSD. So it's a good drive and everything. The problem with it was that it has a heat sink on it that is very, very difficult to take off. If you wanted to put it in a slot in a motherboard and use the heat sink on the motherboard, you're going to have a hard time. You're actually going to, in trying to remove that SSD's heat sink, you're going to risk damaging that SSD, not to mention potentially voiding the warranty. So I'd recommend, if you're going to get that T705, to get it without the heatsink. Most other SSDs that come with the heatsinks, there's little screws or little ways to get the heatsink off so that you can put it on a motherboard and use the motherboard's heatsink, but this one did not. And so that was a bit of a disappointment, in my opinion, on Crucial's part. But other than that, it's a good SSD. So what I ended up doing was, instead of putting it in the M.2-1 spot, I ended up putting it in the M.2-4 spot. Now, I could have put it into the M.2-2 spot, but that shares lanes with the 40 gigabits USB Type-C port. Both the M.2 and the USB Type-C ports would run at ×2. And so didn't want that to happen. The M.2-3 spot shares lanes with the third PCIe slot, which isn't a bad thing, but it's also not a great thing because there's only one thing that you can do for it. You can't disable that PCIe 3 slot The only thing you can do is change it in BIOS to run at ×4 instead of ×2 for that slot, but that ends up disabling the M.2-3 spot. And so it just made the most sense to put it in the M.2-4 spot. Although it is a Gen 4 slot instead of a Gen 5, so we're not going to get max potential out of that SSD, but I didn't necessarily want to risk damaging that SSD that's worth over $500. So yeah, I think it was a good compromise. The screws on the outside of the hard drive caddy that this comes with, and I'll show you some pictures here as I'm talking. They're really tiny screws, and those screws and the screws that went on the swinging side panel that's on the inside for cable management and stuff, and to also mount SSDs with, those tiny screws were like hyper tightened for some reason. And so it became really, really difficult where you risk stripping those screws. So you just got to be careful if you're trying to remove that stuff. Because what I did was I removed that hard drive caddy because this person's not going to be using hard drives. And I removed that swinging door because, one, it was actually blocking some airflow to the fans, to the back of the fans, and I didn't like that. And at the same time, the only reason that swinging door exists is to hide some cables and to potentially mount some 2.5-inch SSDs. And actually the case was a lot easier to work in once I removed that side door as far as cable management goes. So I liked it a whole lot better without it and without the hard drive caddy. And this person isn't going to be using any 2.5-inch SSDs. We got rid of that stuff and it made the whole build actually a lot more pleasant. One thing I did run into was that it was taking forever for the PC to post, and normally on an AMD build it needs a little bit of time for training the memory, but it was taking an inordinate amount of time that I was not used to, and so I started getting worried. And then I remembered, well, I didn't really update the BIOS. And so once I updated the BIOS, it seemed fine. But the symptoms were that it would give you an error code of 10, and then it would just kind of hang. So I'm thinking it was some kind of a loop that it was going through, and it wasn't going past that in order to post. And then sometimes it would give me an error post of 15. It would post, but it would take quite some time. I'd say probably at least 20 to 30 seconds before it would continue past that code onto its next checkpoints for, I'm assuming, the RAM and the CPU and all that stuff before it would finally post. And so it was taking a long time for it to post. But once I updated the BIOS and everything, everything smoothed out and worked fine. And yeah, I know I should have updated the BIOS first, but I forgot all about it. And yeah, sometimes those things happen. So you live and you learn, right? Lastly, the 7900X runs a little hotter than I'm used to for an AMD CPU. So when you go into BIOS, it was showing at idle somewhere in the low 40s. And usually I'm used to low 30s to mid 30s, sometimes even high 20s at idle. And that kind of worried me a little bit as far as whether or not the CPU had enough thermal paste on it. But I put more than enough, I think, on there. So I continued on, and once I looked it up to figure out what was going on with it, so the 7900X has actually a TDP of 170 watts, whereas like the 9900X has 120 watts. And so at 170 watts, that's a lot higher TDP than most AMD CPUs. And so it's going to run a little bit hotter than your other AMD CPUs. So other than that, one last thing about this case. So the reset button isn't really a reset button. It actually changes the RGB lighting. It's a pretty good looking PC. The thermals seem fine. They didn't seem outstanding. They didn't seem concerning. They just seem fine. And which makes me curious as to what the thermals would look like with the mesh front panel that it comes with. But we're not going to get into that because this isn't really a case review. Pretty decent build. It was actually a pretty enjoyable experience. I did like this case, barring the couple of issues that I ran into with the tiny screws. That was a real bitch. But yeah, and obviously the 4070 Super is one of my favorite GPUs. So can't complain there. Other than the fact it's got 12 gigs of memory. It would have been nicer to get 16, but he doesn't need that. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed the information I could provide you as far as some of the individual parts. If you got any questions for me on this build, then feel free to let me know and down in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to get back to you. All right, in the meantime, thanks for joining me, and hope to see you in the next one.